In the early evening hours of December 28, 2282, 6,794 American soldiers were positioned on a series of hills throughout the Stan Valley. Surrounding them were the contested territories of the Baudi Coast, endless jungles and winding rivers that covered the only livable ground on the world of Rosol. The sprawling encampment the Americans occupied reeked with the pervasive sense of dust suppressants, roared with the occasional fire of artillery, and was alive with the energy of soldiers grateful for any reprieve allotted to them. Everywhere, the muted enthusiasm and relief of those personnel whose day was winding down mingled with the growing tension and anticipation of those just getting started. Dusk was a strange time on the Baudi Coast. As the fires and smoke on the horizon were lost in the setting suns, the world resembled what it might have been before the war. And yet, it was during these twilight hours that the danger became most pronounced. The first lesson anyone learned in the Stan Valley was that the enemy preferred to work at night. The first points of light in the darkening skies would follow soon after, joined by more and more, until the whole of the Orion Arm appeared to float overhead. In ancient times, the stars might have provided a sense of awe or comfort. But to the soldiers of the Stan Valley, they only illustrated the scale of the war around them. The brightest lights in the nighttime skies were battlefields just like theirs, more important theaters in a bigger war. That evening, December 28th, 2282, almost no one had ever heard of the Baudi Coast, or the Stan Valley, or even the world of Rosol. But when dawn rose the next morning, the eyes of the entire Orion Arm had become fixated on this place. A remote fortress on a world under siege. A place called Firebase Hector. The United States Army first made landfall across Rosol on August 16, 2278, during the initial stages of the American intervention in the Acadian Wars. The Rosol landings were one of several hundred that occurred across many planetary systems turned battlefields. It was the culmination of a multinational effort intended to prevent the dissolution of the Federation of Acadia and destroy the secessionist and nationalist movements that threatened it. On Rosol, the objectives of the American forces were straightforward: the annihilation of the Acadian National Army units operating on the planet and the disruption of their hidden supply routes. Prior to the war, Rosol had formed the core of pervasive interstellar smuggling networks across Acadia, and many of these had been co-opted or integrated into the secessionist logistics effort. By 2278, it was estimated as much as half of all foreign materiel used by secessionist forces had been funneled through spaceports in Rosol's three major cities: Leafield, Rosaria, and Teague. The battles to cut off these urban centers would become known as the Three Cities Campaign. Key to American objectives on Rosol was the Baudi Coast, a roughly 200-kilometer-long stretch of wilderness around which the three cities were situated. Few overland logistical arteries and only essential infrastructure existed across the coast, which was otherwise overwhelmed with a thick, heavy jungle. It was known for its labyrinth of waterways that snaked through uninviting tracts of swamps, marshes, and mangrove forests before emptying into the deep inlets that lined the Northern Ocean. Where the ground periodically rose from the jungle into thin strips of rugged hills, their foundations were often punctuated by entrances to sprawling natural tunnel systems. These could extend for hundreds of kilometers under the jungle, before emptying through littoral caves scattered across the northern shores. Since the earliest days of colonization, illegal trails had been carved through even the most dangerous sections of the Baudi Coast, circumventing the government routes between the three cities. The Bodie Metro, as it was sometimes known, was vulnerable to flash floods, riddled with natural obstacles, and a preferred nesting site for many of the planet's most dangerous predators. But for over a century, it had facilitated the efficient movement of every manner of restricted commodity across Rosol. Throughout the 2260s, the emerging Acadian National Army found it equally useful, and utilized its hidden routes extensively during early operations in the three cities. By the 2270s, ANA operations in the Bounty Coast had become so sophisticated and far-reaching that the region was being used to facilitate the clandestine movements of personnel and equipment across multiple star systems. Hidden shipments of even the most heavy military equipment, once landed in Leafield, Rosaria, or Teague, could disappear into the metro, only to secretly depart from a different port in a different city. The contents of these shipments would emerge months, weeks, or sometimes just days later, in the hands of secessionists star systems away, having bypassed every border, sanction, and blockade. In the weeks following the initial U.S. landings on Rosol, as fighting in Leafield, Rosaria, and Teague continued to vacillate between conventional warfare and an urban insurgency, the first plans were laid for an outpost on the interior of the Bounty Coast. By establishing a permanent presence between the three cities, American commanders on Rosol looked to remove the metro as a useful tool for ANA forces and dominate overland travel between the three cities. The site selected for this base was a series of hills in the Stan Valley. For this purpose, the Stan Valley held a number of advantages. It was roughly equidistant from the three cities, and was already accessible via existing infrastructure, having previously been selected as the site of the Reflex Bow Interstellar Detection Array. Both the Reflex Bow facility and the surrounding area had been taken from a nationalist brigade just days after the American landings, and had been held by a continuous garrison since their capture. Construction in the Stan Valley was initially limited to a small weather station, an improvised airstrip, and some basic infrastructure that extended access to the Reflex Bow facility. This was finished in January of 2279, and the site designated Forward Operating Base Reflex. The initial fortification of the surrounding area was completed by elements of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, operating on Rosol as part of the 13th Airborne Division. They were joined in FOB Reflex by the 418th Support VTOL Company, better known as the Innkeepers. Throughout 2279, the United States Army used its positions in the Stan Valley to conduct sweeping patrols throughout the coast. Infantry columns and gunship fights operating out of FOB Reflex regularly came into contact with the ANA, at times intercepting arms shipments or other vital supplies. In one notable incident that underlined the strategic impact of the patrols, 7 main battle tanks, export versions of Spanish designs, were found on an abandoned river barge, still half disassembled in civilian shipping containers. The barge had been a part of a nationalist convoy, with the tanks apparently intended for the Castine planetary system, where some of the fiercest fighting in the Acadian Wars was taking place. But fighting in the half-flooded smugglers' caves and overgrown rivers of the Bounty Metro was especially challenging, and FOB Reflex was recognized as one of the most difficult postings on Rosol, even outstripping the escalating violence in the three cities. By September of that year, the need for forces in the Bounty Coast only intensified, and the facilities in Stan Valley had expanded to support upwards of 5,000 personnel and an aviation brigade. It was now one of the largest American military bases on Rosol, outside of the three cities. By November of 2280, ANA counterattacks had repeatedly mauled both Federation and American forces, and in Teague especially, came close to threatening critical landing sites surrounding the city's largest spaceport. As the risk to aerospace craft landing in Teague, Leafield, and Rosaria escalated, FOB Reflex was increasingly relied upon to fill the role of auxiliary airfield, handling overflow traffic from any and all of the three cities. The last major expansion of American facilities in the Stan Valley occurred in the fall of 2281, during which time artillery batteries and missile systems were positioned on several hills surrounding the original Reflex bow facility. The base would now be expected to provide direct fire support not only to American patrols operating throughout the Bounty Coast, but units fighting in the three cities. In recognition of its new battlefield role, and to instill a sense of aggressiveness throughout American forces in the region, facilities in the Stan Valley were collectively renamed Firebase Reflex. 3 days later, it was changed again to honor Staff Sergeant Isabella Hector, killed in action in the Stan Valley, September 29, 2281. Over the next year, Firebase Hector continued to host patrols across the Bounty Coast and provided support for American and Federation forces in the three cities. Its significance as a major airfield was underscored in December of 2281, when American positions in Lee Field were briefly compromised, and Hector was used to support the emergency surge of relief units into the city. In April of 2282, Firebase Hector had reached its peak of over 20,000 personnel, but by summer of that year, the strategic importance of the three cities had evaporated. More reliable supply corridors had been established in other star systems, and the need to haul cargo through the Bounty Coast was nearly gone. American forces were gradually withdrawn from Rosol, and by December of 2282, there remained at Firebase Hector 6,794 soldiers. Attacks made directly on Firebase Hector during the final months of that year were initially interpreted by American commanders as essentially performative. The scattered mortar and small arms fire directed against the base was seen as an impotent gesture made by demoralized ANA remnants to demonstrate their presence in the Bounty Coast after defeats suffered in the three cities. But in responding to these attacks, patrols out of Hector routinely found evidence of large-scale enemy movements, seemingly orchestrated against Firebase Hector itself. On the evening of December 28, 2282, American positions across Rosal came under a sudden and violent assault by units of the Acadian National Army. In the Stan Valley, Firebase Hector was subjected to intense artillery fire, directed predominantly on the base's airstrip. Over the preceding weeks, ANA forces had occupied the hills surrounding Hector and brought up heavy weaponry and equipment. In some cases, they had even managed to penetrate the base's outer perimeter completely undetected. The first 6 days of the siege were marked by sustained exchanges of artillery and close-quarters fighting in several of Hector's supporting outposts. Many of the trench lines running to the outer perimeter had been overrun early in the fighting, and confusion over which positions had been abandoned, isolated, or occupied led to a chaotic and rapidly shifting front line. All throughout the Stan Valley, isolated American units were engaged in grueling and constant jungle warfare, navigating dense vegetation and harsh terrain as they sought to determine the extent of the ANA advance and regain lost positions around the firebase. But on the morning of January 3, 2283, an unprecedented event in American military history turned the developing siege of Firebase Hector into a pivotal moment of the Cold War. At 5:41 a.m., on the outer edge of the Mediana planetary system, a battle group consisting of 38 ANA vessels emerged from an FTL jump, 9 days distant from Rosal. Their strength and disposition forced the withdrawal of the joint American Federation flotilla from orbit, drastically reduced from its peak wartime strength. For the first time, soldiers of the United States were operating in a theater in which the enemy possessed orbital superiority. Fighting in the Stan Valley was at its fiercest January 13th through 15th, when ANA starships were positioned directly over the Bounty Coast. Firebase Hector was subjected to sporadic orbital bombardment during this period, but effective counterfire from terrestrial American positions, including a confirmed kill on a nationalist destroyer, heavily mitigated the impact of ANA starships during the siege. Even so, Attacking forces on the ground would eventually breach the inner perimeter of Firebase Hector, with ANA soldiers reaching as far as the Reflex boat complex. At several points during the fighting, American artillery was diverted off the surrounding hills and into the base itself, with hex rounds fired directly into advancing waves of ANA troops. Orbital supremacy was regained with the arrival of a U.S. Navy task force on January 16th, but fighting continued across Hector and Rosol well into the spring. Without any large-scale landing ships, the task force in orbit could provide only piecemeal support, and the three cities, similarly overwhelmed during the ANA counteroffensive, were given priority. The siege of Firebase Hector was only declared over on April 5, 2283, 99 days after it began. The base itself, devastated during the fighting, was abandoned just weeks later, and everything of value destroyed. It was the start of total American withdrawal from the world of Rosol. In the years following the end of the Acadian War, the Stand Valley has mostly reverted to its pre-war state, with the remains of the firebase completely overgrown. Only the ruins of Reflex Bow can still be found, and militant groups that continue to fight throughout the three cities occasionally occupy the site to score some meager propaganda victory. Within the United States, the Stand Valley has a more controversial legacy. That American soldiers could be fired on from orbit was a shock to the national psyche, fundamentally challenging long-held perceptions of interstellar superiority. While only a minor footnote even in the history of the Acadian War, it catalyzed a profound shift in public sentiment. For the first time, even the citizens of the most powerful nation in the Orion Arm could look to the stars and catch a glimpse of what the defenders of Firebase Hector saw: future battlefields in the endless theater of the Cold War.